Hello, our topic is sacred geometry and Saturn stations. I'm going to tell you something very interesting about the movement of the planet Saturn. As you know, from our point of view, planets sometimes turn retrograde. You probably heard about Mercury retrograde. Oh, horror, horror. Everything's going to go terrible because Mercury's retrograde for 3 weeks. Well, I don't think it's that terrible, but anyway, you've heard of this idea of planets being retrograde. They appear to be going backwards through the stars and through the zodiac from our point of view. They do this for a relatively short period of time, and then they head direct again. So we hear a lot about Mercury going retrograde. Well, all the planets appear to go retrograde at times. When Saturn turns retrograde, it's very, very interesting. It happens at what is considered to be a sacred number, a kind of magical number. It happens at the number 108. As you may know, in Hinduism, they have these prayer beads, and there are 108 beads. In a lot of Buddhist and Hindu temples, there are 108 steps. In Vedic astrology, the astrology of India, there's something called the Navamsa chart, which is extremely important, and there are 108 signs in the Navamsa chart. 108 is a very special number, and very curiously, Saturn stops in the sky at this sacred number. What do I mean by at the sacred number? What I mean is the distance of between Sun and Saturn is 108 to 109 degrees when Saturn stops, always. And it's just an interesting fact that often gets overlooked. And I refer to this as sacred geometry. This is part of the intricacy, this beautiful tapestry, this complexity of numbers that weaves its way through the cosmos and often gets overlooked in modern astrology, where the emphasis is strictly on a few basic aspects that are multiples of 30 degrees. And in that emphasis of these basic aspects that are often used, the conjunction, opposition, square, trine, sextile, it misses the delicacy and intricacy of the magic that's going on. And one of the aspects of this magic, I'm calling it magic just meaning it's awesome, just exquisite, is that Saturn will station, it will stop. There's two kinds of stations. It'll be going forward, stop, and then go retrograde. And then after it's retrograde, meaning it appears to be going backwards, it'll stop and head forwards again. So in both kinds of stations, the station where Saturn turns retrograde and the station where it turns direct, it is 108, the magical special number. According to many religions and mythologies, Saturn stops at this special number. It's also interesting that in astrology, Saturn is often called the timekeeper, as I mentioned here at the bottom of the slide. This timekeeper, Saturn, it's Chronos. Chronos means time. Saturn, the timekeeper, stops at this sacred angle from the sun. Is that cool or what? It's just an interesting observation of a relationship of mythology, symbolic thinking, various religious and ethnic traditions, and the cosmos. And astrologers would believe this actually has real meaning, not just a pretty story. But whether you believe in astrology or not, I think this is very, very fascinating that Saturn stops when it reaches, you might say, the 108th step, the 108th degree from the sun. And let me show you, to make this a little clearer. Joan Baez, you probably know Joan Baez. She was born in 1941. She was a very popular folk singer in the 60s, 70s, actually continuing right up until today. And she happened to be born when, here's the sun up here at 19 degrees Capricorn at the time she was born. And here's Saturn at 7 degrees Taurus. And if we look at this aspect table, and we look at Sun, Saturn, there it is, 108 to 109 degrees apart. This is probably all very small and difficult to read, but what it's saying here is that Sun, it's not so small on my screen, but when we capture it for the video, it's probably difficult to read, but it's saying that the Sun and Saturn are 108 degrees 52 minutes, between 108 and 109 degrees apart. This is a tridecile aspect in astrology. The 108 degrees is 3/10 of a circle. If you calculate it out, you'll see that 108 degrees is 3/10 of a circle. So it's sometimes called a tridecile, tri meaning 3, decile meaning 10, 3/10 of a circle. So it has a 52-minute orb. It's 52 minutes from exactly 108. And if we look over here at the speed of the planets, here's Saturn, and this column is speed. It tells us the speed is 0 because it's stationary. It's not moving. And the S means it's stationary. So it puts a little S there to tell us that it's stationary. Now watch this. I'm going to go to the time adjust. Oh, and by the way, so we have here Sun is 108 degrees before Saturn, because Sun is faster than Saturn going through the sky. So about 108 days after Joan Baez is born, very roughly 108, probably a little more than that, this Sun would catch up to Saturn. So when it reaches 108 to 109 degrees from Saturn, it's stationary. And when the Sun is 108 degrees before Saturn, it's about to turn direct. So what's happened here, when we look at the speed of Saturn, there's no minus sign in front of it. It means it's in direct motion. But moving so slow, we consider it to be stationary. Now watch this. I'm going to go to time adjust. And I'm going to go 4 hours before Joan Baez was born. So I'm selecting 4 hours. I'm going to hit this left arrow to go earlier. And look at this Saturn. It says 0 degrees, 0 minutes, stationary. I go 4 hours earlier, and Saturn was retrograde. So about 4 hours before Joan Baez was born, from 3 to 4 hours before she was born, Saturn went from retrograde to direct. So it had just turned direct. And that's what happens when the Sun is returning. This is called a waning phase. The Sun to Saturn is a waning angle. Sun is returning back to Saturn and just turned direct right before she was born. If I go back to her birth time and I go back 1 hour at a time, I'll change this to 1, you'll see that Saturn is direct. I go back 1 hour, still direct. I go back 2 hours, still direct. I go back 3 hours, still direct. I go back 4 hours, and then we see it's retrograde. So I'm going to cancel out of this time adjust. So to repeat what I've just said, make this clear, 4 hours before Joan Baez was born, Saturn was retrograde. And then it turned direct. So Saturn will turn direct when the angle is 108 degrees, and it's a waning 108 degree aspect. In other words, the Sun is in front of Saturn in the sky. And then when the Sun reaches this point over here, 108 degrees after Saturn, it'll turn retrograde. So Saturn is retrograde from the time the Sun gets 108 degrees past it until the Sun is 108 degrees before it. So while the Sun is near opposition to Saturn, from 108 degrees waxing, leaving Saturn, until 108 degrees waning, it's retrograde. And it stops at the magic number. The timekeeper stops. It's like your heart stops for a moment. Stop. Stillness. Quiet. Saturn's not moving. Right on that magic degree. It's just a fascinating coincidence, you could call it, of how beliefs in astrology and mythology and symbolic ideas, how they relate to the motions of the sky. And one of the reasons this has been overlooked in astrology is because in modern astrology, there isn't much emphasis on angular distances other than particular ones. And of course, astronomers, wouldn't make much note of it because they're not interested in interpreting this or relating it to mythology and belief systems and so on. Okay, now, okay, so let me make this clearer. Give a little more detail about this. What happens is that Saturn turns retrograde when the Sun is 108 to 109 degrees past. When the Sun is 108 to 109 degrees past Saturn, that's what I just said. This is a waxing aspect, and more specifically, it's a separating waxing 3/10 aspect. So when the Sun gets 108 degrees past Saturn, that's called a tridecile. And from the time the Sun is tridecile Saturn at exactly 108 degrees, and as the Sun heads towards 109 degrees, Saturn will turn retrograde. So it's during this separating, waxing 3/10 aspect that Saturn turns retrograde. If you're not familiar with thinking about waxing and separating, you might want to listen to this video a few times until you get it. All I'm really saying is that from the time the Sun is 108 to 109 degrees past Saturn is when Saturn will turn retrograde. So it's during the waxing, separating 3/10 aspect that Saturn stations. It stops and turns retrograde. And Saturn will turn direct, also 108 to 109 degrees, in the waning 3/10 aspect. That's when the Sun is on its way back to Saturn, waning aspect, and it's an applying waning aspect. So Saturn always stations during it turns retrograde during the separating waxing 3/10 aspect, and it turns direct during the applying waning 3/10 aspect. Okay, so now if you're into astrology, what does it mean? Well, here's what it means from the astrological viewpoint. These times when Saturn stations are a celebration of creative work. So rather than Saturn stations being terrible, I've heard astrologers saying, oh no, Saturn's stationary today. This is terrible because Saturn's supposed to be a malefic, it's bad, it stops, so its power is greater. Last thing you want in life is for a malefic thing out there to stop and put pressure on you, and nothing seems really bad to happen when Saturn's stationary, but it's believed it should be bad just based on the logic of it, and it's actually something very good, because what you get is the gift of focused and meaningful creativity, because 10 is 5 times 2, and in vibrational astrology, I have many dozens of videos on vibrational astrology and research that's done. 5 is creative, 10 is 5 times 2, is shared creativity. So Saturn focuses, it directs us, it defines us, so it defines your creative endeavors. So what happens when Sun and Saturn are in 3/10 aspect is this feeling that work is not a burden, but rather a creative experience. So we plant a garden not by the sweat of the brow, that image that, you're plowing the fields and it's hot and you have to work the day to get food, to survive. Rather than work being arduous like that, it's creative. It's a shared creative endeavor. So it's a kind of liberation from the shackles, a kind of slavery, being bound to where your work becomes creative. That's what happens when Sun and Saturn are in a 3/10 aspect. And that would reflect the life of Joan Baez. She is a folk singer and a songwriter who sings about issues that are important, no-nonsense topics. Hunger, abuse, war. She focuses her attention on what's really fundamental and important, not light things. And she's wonderfully gifted as a creative person, unbelievable voice, and ability to communicate through music. So her life represents the qualities of Sun Saturn. Focus and defining yourself on something important, that really has lasting value and done in a creative way, not by hard labor and quote sweat of the brow. Okay. All right. So I've already explained this. Now, how do I know that these stations happen between 108 and 109 degrees? More specifically, I found that the stations occur between 108 degrees 40 minutes and 109 degrees 10 minutes. And the waning applying times tend to be slightly small orbs than the waxing separating. So when Saturn turns direct in the waning phase, the orb, the distance from 108 degrees tends to be smaller in the last half of the 20th century. How do I know that? I just ran in my software, the Sirius 2.0 software, I just selected a listing to tell me that. And I'll show you the listing. So I have here in the bottom paragraph, I discovered this by producing a listing of Saturn stations and also when the Sun-Saturn 3/10 aspects occur. So I'll show you that quickly in case you want to research this, and if you have different software, you could find out if that software has the same features and how to do it. But in the Sirius software, you go to Forecast, and they go to Transit Text Listing, and then Transit to Transit. It means not relating to Joan Baez's chart or whoever's chart I'm looking at, but just what's in the sky, and it says stations. Station, void of course, etc. So I select that, and then I select stations. Planet stations, regular planets. You could select any of these. So I select stations, which I've already selected, so it tells me I've already selected it. I go to Customize, and then I only want Sun and Saturn, and the only aspect I want is the 3/10. And there's an option here to make your aspect waxing and waning only, measured 0 to 360. So I call one of them a 3/10 X for waxing. So this, I selected wax or wane only, and I said 108. And over here I also selected wax or wane only, 252. 252 means 252 plus 108 is 360. So it's the waning aspect. So I specify I want 108 degrees measured 0 to 360, and I want 252 degrees measured 0 to 360, and I put N for waning. And now I've made my selections, and I can just click OK. I'll run this for, say for 5 years. We'll just start January 1st, 2000, for example. Click OK. And then up here it tells me it's calculating because it takes a little while. And there are the 5 years. And it's telling me that Saturn turned direct at 10/17 on January 12th at 4:59 a.m. I left this as Greenwich Mean Time. You can also select a location in the previous screen, but this is in Greenwich Mean Time, also known as Universal Time. And then it tells me that the 3/10 aspect occurs waning and then waxing, and then Saturn turns retrograde and so on. And I actually ran this for a long period of time. And here is when I ran, I think, for 100 years, starting in 1940. And then I made some observations. I turned these, I just put it into a word processing program, changed this to red, and I just examined it. I found this, very exciting. Is there some kind of pattern or design to these times at Saturn stations? And I found that every year, Saturn will station about 14 degrees later. So, for example, on August 27, 1940, Saturn turned retrograde. And then it turned retrograde again on September 10th, 1941. So it's about 14 days, 10 to 14 days later. And the sun moves about a degree a day, so you can think of it as degrees or days. So Saturn will station twice a year. It'll turn retrograde, then it'll turn direct, about 4 months apart, and then those two special days will occur about 2 weeks later the following year, and then 2 weeks later the following year. So in 1940, Saturn turned retrograde in August, turned direct in January. Let me separate this out. Well, this is 40 to 41. So if I just separate this out a little bit, might make it a little easier. I'll put a space here before each red one. Okay, so what we're seeing here is that Saturn turned retrograde on August 27, 1940, and then a few weeks later in 1941, September 10, then in late September in 42, and then it turns retrograde in early October. So it's about 2 weeks later each time, and it turns retrograde in this case in late August, and then turns direct about 4 months later. So August 27, September, October, November, December, almost 4.5 months later, it will then turn direct. So you get these two special times. They're like holidays, celebration times, when Saturn stops in the sky for this focused creativity, and then happens next year 2 weeks later, and then the following year 2 weeks later. So two special times separated by 4.5 months. So those are the special times right there when Saturn is stationary. Joan Baez happened to be born at one of those special times. So I discovered this by producing a listing in the Sirius software. I can also show you this. If I wanted a simpler listing without the aspects, I can right-click, go to Customize, go to Aspects, remove the aspects, and now I click OK, and I will get just the station time. So now I've got a simpler list of just the station times. So you can set that up however you want to set it up. And I just looked at my listing, and I found this out just by looking at it. Now, what I noticed, looking at this more carefully, spent some time looking at this listing, is, as I said, there are two times this happens each year. One time when Saturn turns retrograde, 4.5 months later it turns direct. You can think of these as happy Labor Days, days in which we celebrate labor as something creative rather than a kind of slavery. Rather than labor being sweat of the brow, labor could be fun. We could be building our houses and having fun doing it, designing it creatively, not just thinking about how much money we're making or something like that. Work and focused attention as a creative experience. That's what this energy is about. And these celebration times of work as something creative, more specifically, here's exactly how they work. There are two each year. One of them, it lasts about a day and ends when Saturn turns retrograde. So as the sun is leaving Saturn and goes from 108 to 109 degrees, it lasts from the time of the 3/10 aspect, from the time Sun and Saturn are exactly 108 degrees apart, until Saturn turns retrograde, which will be about a half a day to a day later. That would be the celebration time. And then about 4.5 months later, as the Sun returns back to Saturn, it's going to last from the time Saturn turns direct until about a day later when the 3/10 aspect occurs. So one holiday occurs for a day before Saturn turns retrograde, and the other holiday occurs for a day after it turns direct. So it's kind of interesting. So let me say that again. You could think of these holiday periods as these special times. One of them occurs for about a day before Saturn turns retrograde. This is from the time the 3/10 aspect occurs until the retrograde. The other one occurs for about a day after Saturn turns direct. So Saturn turns direct, and then the 3/10 aspect will occur after Saturn turns direct. It's a little complex. You might feel like you're getting dyslexic about exactly how this works, but the main point is there's a very clear, specific pattern going on, which is very fascinating, of Saturn stopping at this magical number 108, and an exact relationship between the 108 and the station time. And that time in between the exact 108 and the station is this very special time where Sun and Saturn are close to being exactly 108 degrees apart, and also Saturn very close to being stopped, stationary in the sky. It's just very, you might say, beautiful, amazing. We sometimes use this term sacred geometry, that the special time when time stops, when Saturn stops, is also the time that it's 108 degrees from the Sun. And we can measure that time period very exactly, and that's what the listing does for us. So as I said, these days, these time periods of about 1 day, when Saturn is stationary and in 3/10 aspect to the Sun, you can think of them as happy Labor Days. We celebrate that work can be creative and interesting rather than just the sweat of the brow. It is a kind of celebration of freedom from slavery, where slavery is being shackled to a life of tedious and unsatisfying work. So the 3/10 aspect is pleasant. It has 3 in the numerator, but more importantly, it is a shared creative work, 5 times 2, and the creative achievements of a team or family and the service it provides to others. So these are days when we celebrate our ability to do creative work with others. If we have a team of people that we work with, growing gardens or building houses, writing software, whatever it might be, that the work can be creative and it's a shared experience and you have a team effort. Now, there's a slight difference between the first, you could call it holiday time, the celebration time, when Saturn turns retrograde, and the 4.5 months later when Saturn turns direct. When Saturn turns retrograde, this is the feeling of it in the sky. I don't know how I would validate this through research, but we could imagine that this time period when Saturn turns retrograde is a holiday that celebrates what has been achieved through our creative work. We can look at the house that was built, the garden that was planted, the software that was written, the classes that were taught, and the students that graduated. We notice the little details that we will change in the future. We may put a few finishing touches on our work, but mostly we express appreciation and enjoy what was achieved. So when Saturn turns retrograde, and it's 3/10 from the Sun, it will always be 3/10 from the Sun when it turns retrograde, we're reflecting back on what we did, we enjoy it, we think about what was achieved, we look at the house that was built, we think about the students that graduated and will go on to do wonderful things in the world if we're teachers. We reflect on it. It is a time of gratefulness, a vow to think and feel more deeply about what new insights, awareness, and sensitivity we can draw on for the next creative venture. And maybe in next year's garden we will try a new herb or flower, or in the next house we build we'll utilize a new kind of solar energy panel. So we're reflecting, enjoying, giving thanks, and diving deeper and thinking about what the next project will be like and how we can enhance it even more. We think and meditate on these creative projects. We learn from others and explore new possibilities. It is a time for us to put down the shovel and take some time to enjoy learning from others and to become deeper and more mature before we begin the next project. A time of reflection on what we did and how we can do it even better next time, or evolving to what it will be in the future. Now, when Saturn turns direct, this is more like the beginning of a new project. Saturn's turning direct. So during the waning 3/10 aspect, when Saturn turns direct, it's a holiday that celebrates what we can now begin, a new journey. We put our plans into action. It is a kind of planting season or breaking ground time for starting the project that has been planned. When Saturn turns direct, the Sun is applying to Saturn to make the 3/10 aspect. So it's an applying aspect to the 3/10 when Saturn turns direct. This is the case for Joan Baez. Saturn had just turned direct and is applying to the 3/10 aspect. So you'll see here, for example, in the background, it has an A in this aspect grid. Sun Saturn A means applying. It's an applying 3/10 aspect. It's increasing in strength. It's a waning aspect, but the aspect is increasing in strength. Creativity increases and reaches fulfillment within about a day after Saturn turns direct. Okay, so to capture the feeling of these happy Labor Days, they're not excuses to just have fun. Nothing wrong with just having fun. That would be more of like a Jupiter thing or something. But this is Sun Saturn. So what these holidays celebrate is it's a time to think about our focus and clarity and dedication to the work, to a project. People who are slow at work and attentive are not celebrating happy Labor Days. So the trick, you might say, the delicate balance is to work hard, feel that you are involved, interested, and concerned about the results. Your attention is clear. This is Saturn. But it's fun. It's fun to be focused. And this is maybe a big lesson for humanity, that fun is not always just relaxing. That if you're attentive and involved, you're growing the garden, you're building the house, you're writing the software, you're planning your lesson plans, you're delivering your classes, whatever it is you do, you're deeply involved, very creative, and that's enjoyable too. So work can be enjoyable and rest can be enjoyable. So you go to the store, you do your best to get a great color and good quality paint. Here's a scenario where you're painting something. You take care, time, and attention to paint the room very nicely and to work efficiently. This is Sun Saturn. The joy is in gaining mastery at producing an excellent creative result, so that when somebody walks in the room, they can feel the effect of the attention to detail and the creative insight that went into the work. So something as simple as painting a room. Creative work doesn't mean you're necessarily a Rembrandt, or some genius artist. You might be painting a room, but taking the time to make sure everything's nicely done and picking the right color and making sure the paint is on there thick. Maybe you have to put on a second coat, and giving that attention and enjoying that attention, not just thinking, oh, I want to be done with it so I can get paid for this. Enjoying the creative process and the attention. That's the magic and the beauty of Sun Saturn 3/10 aspect and Saturn stationary at the same time. Always happens. Whenever Sun and Saturn are 3/10, Saturn is stationary. Excuse me. So rather than Saturn stations being oppressive and difficult, as some astrologers think of them, they are times when we can attune more clearly to our individual and collective creative paths. Okay, I won't read this. I think this repeats. If you want, you can stop this and read this. But this repeats what I just said. Let me just go over this. Slavery can be subtle, such as when we are not at all inspired by our work. Slavery can also be overt and cruel, where people are literally enslaved. The happy Labor Days are days to protest and take action against slavery, either literal slavery or the slavery of boredom and apathy and being stuck to a job that's not meaningful. To free ourselves, to discover and express our creative inspiration by dedicating ourselves to the work. Not only do we then live more satisfying and fulfilling lives, but the work actually gets better and everyone benefits. And slavery is a disease that still exists in the 21st century and must be abolished. I've got a typo here. Must be abolished. So this is the emphasis of these happy Labor Days. Abolish slavery. Make life enjoyable. And Joan Baez and other people born at these times, I think, will convey this message in their lives. This will be a strong feeling in their lives, that they're creative and want everybody to be able to live a life that's creative and fun while you're also dedicated to the work. So holiday are holy days. You can think of holiday as a way of saying holy days. There are days when we celebrate something beautiful in our lives, often something natural and inherent in our lives that we take for granted, such as Mother's Day, Father's Day. We stop for a moment and think about something that makes life possible, makes life beautiful, has a big impact in our lives. So happy Labor Days, in this sense, are important holidays. Maybe someday people will greet each other on these days and say, Happy Labor Day, or Happy for short. Anyway, they are special days. Reminds me of calculating Easter in the Middle Ages. they would have astrologers would calculate when Easter begins, because it's also based on calendars and when new moons occur and so on. Well, now we can use our computer software, like I showed you, to calculate these time periods. Okay, so I've already mentioned this. People born during these time periods have this ability to direct their energies in creative ways. By the way, a 3/10 aspect using vibrational astrology has an orb of 1 degree 36 minutes. And so these time periods when Saturn turns retrograde or turns direct, when its stations are within the 1 degree 36 minute orb. So they are within orb of the 108 degree aspect, the 3/10 aspect. This is a little bit technical, but just to clarify that point, it is really true that based on the principles of what we call vibrational astrology, Saturn stations within orb of being in a 3/10 aspect. There's an intricately beautiful tapestry of energies going on, fascinating patterns that get overlooked in modern astrology because the emphasis is just on a few basic kinds of geometric relationships. And the actual geometric relationships that occur are very beautiful and exquisite. And this is just one example of it. And there are many special times. I say here, every moment brings its own gift. So don't be jealous if you're not born like Joan Baez at that special time. Most people aren't. There are other very special things. I just want to mention that. Okay. And I mentioned this already, the 108. I think this is my final statement here. Just to summarize, this 108 is a special number. Time stops, Saturn stops right at this special point. It's fascinating, really, really incredible. If nothing else, I hope that this video gives you a new vision of how we can see planetary relationships, the more subtle and intricate things that are going on that we miss, in a kind of blunt approach that's used to understanding angular distances. In any case, it is a fact that Saturn stops at exactly 108 to 109 degrees. At least it did from 1940 to 2040 when I tested it. I didn't go back 1,000 years. I could do that and test it again. I think it would hold up, but that's what I verified in the calculation. I just ran it for contemporary time period. And I'm pretty sure it would hold up for all time periods, but that should be verified. Okay, that's it, my friends. So here's a link to our software. I'm one of the developers of the Series 2.0 software that we're using in this video. Here's the link to that website. I'm also one of the developers for the Matrix software, which is astrologysoftware.com. Here's the YouTube page of all the videos. Also, if you go to the astrosoftware.com website, click on articles and videos, and then go to videos, you get a beautiful index into all the videos. We have way over 200 now, and growing. Okay, my friends, thank you for listening. God bless. Namaste.